Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today I'm going to focus on this mark scheme to paper 2 and we're focusing on the poetry comparison essay. We'll be looking at an exam practice done by one of my students, and the question was, how do the poets present ideas about power in My Last Duchess and One Other Poem? It's only a short essay, as you can see, 452 words, which is roughly 10 words per minute. So that's a total that most of you will be able to improve on. But I'm going to show you how an examiner would grade it. So I'll dip in and out of the essay and I'll zoom in here on the top thing that you could do, which is being convincing, having a critical analysis, and I'll show you where the essay does that or could do that. This column is the one that the examiners focus on first. So if you understand these words, you will be able to get into the top band. The band below, which is still a very good mark, 21 to 25 out of 30, is thoughtful and developed, and you'll see how you can do that even in 450 words. And I'll try to show you the difference between thoughtful and developed and clear understanding. Okay, let's read the first paragraph of the essay and see how the student tries to control the examiner's thoughts. In both poems, My Last Duchess and Ozymandias, the poets explore ideas about how those in power exploit others. In My Last Duchess, for instance, when the persona refers to My Last Duchess painted on the wall, this shows that the Duke is proud of his previous wife and keeps a painting of her that only he is allowed to view. So the first thing that happens is that he, I know it's a he, so I'm not being sexist here, tells the examiner which two poems he's comparing. He also has another psychological advantage in that he deliberately chooses two which are 19th century poems, which the examiner knows are therefore more difficult, traditionally seen as more difficult, and so this encourages the examiner to think you're a better candidate. That's a little psychological trick, and also it's much better for your revision, by the way, because if you know all the 19th century poems, you will be able to, there's a high chance that one of them will be named and you'll be able to do this trick. The next thing he's done is made sure that he's using the right terminology, so he calls the character a persona. He's also integrating quotations into his sentence, so this fits in the sentence and makes sense inside it. It is an embedded quotation. Now this is going to count for quite a lot, despite what he says here, that the Duke is proud of his previous wife. Well, of course, he wasn't proud of her at all, was he? He had her executed. And what this student means is that he is proud of the painting of his wife. Now, I am giving this student the benefit of the doubt because that earlier bit was so well written. Okay, and that's what I'm talking about when I say controlling the examiner's mind. Because it might be that this student doesn't realise that the Duke is not proud of his wife at all. This might be an actual error of understanding rather than of writing under pressure. But as an examiner, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. So let's go into the terminology AO2. We've got subject terminology used effectively already, and so I'm automatically, as an examiner, prompted to think that this is in level 5. And this means I'm prompted to think it must be thoughtful. When I look at the quotation, I told you it was embedded, and that's what integrated means. It's integrated into the essay. So I'm automatically guided by that opening, never mind the rest of the essay, to go for level 5. Let's see what happens in the second paragraph. This implies that he is protective of his now dead wife and won't let just anyone view the painting. The use of the pronoun my suggests the Duke is possessive of his wife and treats her as a treasure or collectible instead of a person. Perhaps the poet has so this should be was highlighting the way those in power exploit others, in this case through the objectification of the Duke's previous wife. So we've got terminology again through this word here, objectification, turning a person into an object. And we've got this language of interpretation, perhaps. This signals to the examiner that you are considering more than one point of view. Right, let's come down to AO3 then and see how he's controlling the examiner's thoughts again. So you need a thoughtful consideration of the writer's ideas or perspectives, and as soon as you introduce a word like perhaps, you automatically appear thoughtful. I'm just giving you this one point of view, it seems to suggest, although I accept that other points of view are possible. This is the idea behind what being thoughtful is. Now let's go to AO2. That idea of objectification, that is a writer's method. And it's considering that method, what effect that's going to have on the reader, that's going to put this candidate again into level 5. Now let's look at the terminology pronoun. The examiner doesn't need you to mention whether something's a noun or a verb or an adjective, unless you're making a point about it being that. Now here it's important that the word my is a pronoun, because pronouns here are possessive pronouns, and our student is linking the idea of the possessive pronoun to the possessive emotion of the Duke. So that's why he gets credit for this terminology, because he's linking it to the meaning. Right, in the next paragraph he is going to write a comparison, because he knows that's where the marks are, and he'll give us a connective to show whether it's a similarity or a difference. Similarly, Shelley suggests that tyrannical dictators also use their power to exploit others. So he's saying there's a similarity in the motive of the two rulers, the Duke in the first poem and the dictator in this one. This is evidenced when Ozymandias has a sneer of cold command. There you have integrated quotations again that fit into the sentence. This implies that the pharaoh enjoys controlling his subjects and doesn't treat them well. The adjective cold highlights the pharaoh's, I should have put an apostrophe there, terribly sorry, uncaring nature towards his subjects, emphasizing Ozymandias' tyrannical leadership. In both poems, the poets examine the way those in power control others. Okay, now this is a less successful paragraph. It has interesting terminology in it. So we've got emphasizing, suggests, this is evidenced, this implies. Yeah, this is all terminology because it's the kind of language you need to use to write about literature. But he's introduced the idea that cold is an adjective. Well, it is an adjective, that's 100% right. But he's not writing about why having adjectives is important here. And therefore it's not relevant that it's an adjective. It's a bit like saying, I smelt the meal using my nose. And you would go, yeah, because that's what you smell with. Like, what else would you use? And it's the same here, you know, because if he's describing something, well, obviously he's going to use an adjective because you can't describe with something else. So it's just redundant. And the examiners don't want you to just chuck these words in for no reason. Okay, but the main problem with this is it isn't thoughtful. If we look at the last sentence, in both poems, the poets examine the way those in power control others. A thoughtful way would be to tell us, well, what is it about the way that power controls others that the poets are interested in? Just saying that power controls other people is not a thoughtful explanation. It's just a clear explanation. So that paragraph only shows a clear understanding. It's not developing any ideas. It's just saying, here's an idea, but I can't be bothered to explain it all to you. However, in the next paragraph, he's now going to start introducing a much more thoughtful idea. Again, it's comparing the two poems. In both Ozymandias and My Last Duchess, the poets explore the theme of artwork being used as a medium to present a person's power, through showing those in power with statues and art. In My Last Duchess, the Duke boasts about his power through his artwork. This is clear when the Duke speaks to his visitor. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. This suggests that the Duke is in fact the powerful sea god Neptune, whereas the Duchess is the rare seahorse being tamed by the Duke. So this is clearly thoughtful now. He's arguing that the artwork is just a medium to represent a person's power, and he's also suggesting that the Duke here has used the artwork deliberately to emphasize his own power. It's not just Browning who's using this artwork. The persona in the poem himself is using this artwork for the very same reason. He nearly fully explains the idea that the Duke sees himself as the powerful sea god Neptune. Just left like this, it might mean that Browning sees him that way, which isn't true. And this also might be read to suggest that the Duchess sees herself as being the rare seahorse tamed by the Duke, which of course might be true. She might realise that the Duke sees her as less than human, just a seahorse, and that the most important part about her relationship with the Duke is that she's being tamed. Now, that isn't all spelt out, but it is strongly hinted at. So what we now have is another interpretation looking at how the art represents something else, the medium of art, and that again is the writer's method, using the medium of art to explore ideas about power. So our next question is, how do we get to be convincing? Well, one of the words that you get to focus on is this idea of exploring an idea. Exploration. Look, it pops up here and it pops up here. What do you do when you explore? Well, that's when our really useful word perhaps comes into play. If you have more than one interpretation and you say perhaps this and then later on but perhaps that, then you're being exploratory. Now let's read this paragraph to see if the perhaps introduces just one interpretation or whether it introduces two. The use of this metaphor, there's the subject terminology again, reinforces the harshness and control of those in power. So that's the effect on the reader. That's telling us why that metaphor's there. It makes us realise how harsh the person in power is. Perhaps the poet was highlighting the way that those with power express it through the medium of artwork. Similarly, Shelley suggests that tyrannical leaders use artwork to express their superiority towards others. So this is a little bit different. It's not just saying that he's got power, he's saying that he wants to show that he's superior and better than others. And so the hierarchy is what's important here, rather than just being powerful on its own. This is clear when Ozymandias states, "Look upon my works, you mighty, and despair." This implies that the pharaoh is trying to ward off potential rivals by scaring them with artwork. So this is a quite interesting idea. The idea of warding off potential rivals is a pretty good one, because we've got this image of the statue out in the desert. Maybe it's placed there in a remote place to actually show potential invaders what they'd be coming up against. But that isn't fully explained here. It's hinted at again. So again, this is thoughtful rather than convincing in the top band. The verb despair conveys that the pharaoh wants his rivals to be completely terrified by just a statue of himself, implying that in person he will be so much more terrifying. So that's beginning to be quite a well-developed point there, that he will be even more terrifying than his statue. We've got this terminology that despair is a verb, but it's not important to our interpretation that it's a verb, and therefore that doesn't really score any marks. But there's plenty more terminology that does. So we've got metaphor. We've got the idea that one idea is reinforced. That's terminology that you would use in any literature essay. So is highlighting, and so is similarly and suggests. So you can see how terminology isn't just about spotting techniques and features. The perhaps didn't really give us two fully different interpretations. It gave us one interpretation and then a slightly different one about the superiority as opposed to just power. So the examiner goes back to that exploration word and thinks, well, this candidate is nearly exploring, is beginning to do it. So it's not just examining, it's not just thoughtful. I think I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. So I'm now stuck between 25 marks and 26. Now I could go back to the earlier paragraph, which remember I thought was only in the level 4. Remember there are 6 levels, we're not talking about grades here in the mark scheme. So this was a sort of middle level, and that would colour my view a little bit, and that might say, well, I don't want to go up into the 26 because they had this paragraph that just wasn't as well developed. And this is where length would have helped the student, because we now come to the final paragraph, so it doesn't really have an opportunity to be developed. Potentially the poet was highlighting the way that those in power use artwork as a medium to express their power. It's very true, but you've already said that, so no extra marks yet. Shelley wanted the readers to be alerted to how those in power abuse their status. Good, that's a new point. I'll accept that. In both poems, the poets explore the expression of power through pieces of artwork. Well, that's also true, but you've already said it. So we've got this new idea about status, which hasn't fully been explored. So that's a valuable lesson. In order to convince the examiner, you do have to write more. But let's see what happens in the examiner's head now. So we're going back to our level 5 and thinking, well, can I give only 452 a level 5 mark? Let's go across now and see what the further words are for the examiner to look at. Was it thoughtful? Yes, it was. We had all those perhapses. Was it developed? Well, not fully, not properly, because it wasn't long enough. Were the references integrated? Yes, all the quotations and references fit inside sentences. Did it examine methods? Yeah, we had quite a few of those. And the subject terminology was used effectively, even though I criticise, just chucking in that it's a verb. Was there an indication of the effects on the reader? Yes, every time he wrote about what it makes us think, that was an effect. Did it consider different perspectives? It did. Did it consider the context? Well, yes, it considered the context of the poem, so, what's going on inside the poem, but it doesn't really look at any of the context of the time. It doesn't talk about Shelley as a romantic poet, writing about dictators in his own society. It doesn't talk about Napoleon in any way or democracy. And similarly, in My Last Duchess, he doesn't really talk about Browning reacting against the aristocracy and the ruling classes, or why Browning is writing this kind of poem as a monologue to entertain his Victorian readership, who no doubt would have enjoyed performing these by the fireside. So there isn't really a consideration of the context. But this line means that you don't have to have a context and the perspective and ideas. You can just have all. So even though there isn't that element of real historical contextual detail, it doesn't matter. So I then have to come down to a gut reaction. Do I think it's developed or not? So let's review what's happened so far. The examiner starts here with this column. Then they move into that column, and I'm still not sure how developed it is. So I look for some more help in the final column. A candidate's response is likely to be thoughtful, detailed and developed. Oh, it's got some detail in it, but not that much. It takes a considered approach to the comparison with references integrated. Yes, I had that. There will be a detailed examination of the effects. Well, then we've got that detailed word. But what will it be the effects of? Language and or structure and or form supported by use of subject terminology. Well, here we've got a bit of an issue because at this level You need something about the poem's structure or something about the poem's form, and he hasn't done that, has he? So now we know something really useful. Writing about structure or form is a deal breaker to get you into level 5. But let's flip it another way. Writing about structure or form forces the examiner to think about putting you in level 5 because that's the first time that structure and form becomes compulsory. If we look at the bottom of level 5, it says that you will have level 4 and be starting to demonstrate thoughtful comparison. Well, we've definitely had a thoughtful comparison. Let's go down to level 4 and see if you also need form or structure. Let's go and have a look. Let's have a look here. A range of references. There will be clear explanation of a range of methods, subject terminology, ideas, perspectives, contextual factors. No structure and no form. So suddenly I've got a route into this exam to control the way the examiner thinks and force the examiner to put me higher up the mark scheme. Because if I write about the structure and form, I am going to be better than clear understanding. That means I'm going to be better than 20 out of 30 marks. That means I'm going to be better than 66%. Now, 66% is a huge grade. It means I'm going to be on for a grade 6 as long as I convincingly write about the structure and form. Now, because I haven't written about it, or my student hasn't here, I've got to go in the bottom range of marks out of the 21 to 25. But wherever the examiner puts me here, I'm going to be at least a grade 6. Okay? And if I put the structure and form in, I'm going to go up. I'm going to go potentially to the top of 25, which would be a grade 7. And that is fantastic news. You can get into grade 7 by doing what that essay did, which was only 450 words, but adding in some interesting ideas about the form and structure. Well, there's an easy way to get the form and structure in. So this video, Easy Method to Compare Poems for Top Grades, tells you about the FOSS methods, and F stands for form and the second S stands for structure. Hopefully I'll be organised to put the link up here so that you can watch this video and find out what it means to write about form and structure. So I wrote a grade 9 essay at the same time as my class using that structure. And so this is how I started. My Last Duchess is a monologue written in iambic pentameter. Now that's a description of the form. I get no marks for just describing it. I've got to link that to the meaning. So Browning does this to convey the Duke's inner thoughts and his skill in manipulation. He manipulates people just as he manipulates language. What I'm getting at there is the iambic pentameter is a strict verse form, and the examiner knows it's a strict verse form that involves you having 10 syllables per line. One is unstressed and the next is stress. And this is what I mean about having to manipulate language. I don't have to spell all that out because this is common knowledge. The examiner knows that's what iambic pentameter is. And so they know why I'm saying this is a manipulation. And it makes sense to the examiner when I say, well, that's because the Duke is manipulating people. He is a manipulative person. That's why it is written in this form, because it is the Duke's monologue. Okay, so that's a way to talk about the form of the poem and get it to relate to the meaning of the poem. When I'm writing about Ozymandias, I talk about the form of the poem as a sonnet, traditionally a love poem. Okay, well, how does that relate to the meaning? Well, it ironically portrays Ozymandias' self-love. So he is in love with himself. That's why it's written as a love poem, as a sonnet. Shelley makes clear that others despised him as a ruler, which is exemplified by the sculptor, who read Ozymandias' passions but mocked them in the carving of his face. So you can see I've tried to link what I've said about the form of the poem being a sonnet, a love poem, to the meaning, which is Shelley criticising Ozymandias' self-love. Okay, well, how do I write about the structure of the poem? It's actually really easy. One way is to use the word structure. And because these poems are 19th century poems, they all rhyme. So I can easily write about the rhyming structure and then say why it's there. So both poets use a rhyming structure to reveal the vanity of their protagonists. Shelley links the instruction Ozymandias gives, that all other mighty rulers should look upon his achievements and despair, to the ironic decay of all that he has built, which is now boundless and bare. This suggests that the passing of time and the judgment of history should have led Ozymandias to despair at his own vanity. Yeah, and that's because of the way he rhymes despair and bare. He's showing that his own creation has become bare, which is like the despair he wants other people to feel, but actually he should feel himself. So that's how I've attempted to show that the rhyming structure is an attack on Ozymandias' own vanity. Then I have to look at the other poem. Browning portrays the Duke's self-centered vanity through the final couplet. And so this is another instance of structure. Couplet is a rhyme in 2 lines, so that's structure. But I've also added in this idea of it being final. And I always tell my students, write about the ending of the poems and say why they end that way. And that is an element of structure. You're saying why the poem has ended that way. That's its structure, isn't it? And so you're writing about structure when you talk about final. So 2 ways to make sure you write about the structure is always to use the word structure and rhyming if you can, and then always write about the ends of the poems, the final bits, because that's also its structure. Right, let's go back to the mark scheme one final time. Remember, I don't get marks just for writing that the structure's there and the form is there. I've got to examine the effects, and that's what I did. I tried to link it to the meaning of the poem or what it tells us about the protagonists. That's why you get the marks when you talk about the structure or the form. And the final thing that's interesting for me here is that I've taught this method in my films, in my videos that you get to watch, and this is a class that I only teach once a week, and my school doesn't teach this method. And so I wanted to see if this method would have helped the student you've just read get into the top grades. And it would. You can see that not having the FOSS method is what's holding him back. And I don't mean, you can only do it with the FOSS method. This is just a way to make sure you're writing about the structure and make sure you're writing about the form. Hopefully you'll remember that I wrote about the form first off. I talked about it being a dramatic monologue written in iambic pentameter, to force myself to hit that exam criteria, which would force the examiner to put me at least at level 5. So you now know how to improve your grade dramatically, even if you're only writing 450 odd words. So go across, look at that video, put some comments below telling me whether you found this useful or not, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos getting you the very top grades.